A wrong number usually ends with an awkward apology. For Maribel Knox, it ended with a revolution. Trapped in a pitch-black penthouse with a fractured skull and vision that flickered like a dying light bulb, Maribel was hiding from a man the world called a saint, but she knew as a monster. She tried to text her emergency contact. Her vision was swimming in red. Her fingers were numb. She mistyped a single digit. That message did not go to her best friend. It went to the encrypted, private line of Kang Jae-Hyun, the Tiger of Seoul. A man whose name was whispered in fear across 3 continents, and whose phone had been silent for years. What happens when a broken woman accidentally summons the most dangerous man on the planet? The answer is violent, breathtaking, and inevitable. This is the story of He Broke My Head. The sensation of a skull fracturing isn't a loud bang. It is a sickening, internal thud, a vibration that echoes in your teeth and turns the world into static. Maribel felt the floor rush up to meet her before she realized Daniel had actually struck her. Then, the ringing started. A high-pitched whistle that drowned out the sound of her own gasping breath. At 29 years old, Maribel had already lost her family and her fortune, only to be saved by the most influential man in the city. She didn't know that being saved by Daniel Whitlock was just another word for being buried alive. Kindly like, subscribe, and ring the bell, because once the tiger is summoned, there is no going back. Daniel stood over her, looking down at her crumpled body as if he were inspecting a chip in expensive porcelain. He didn't scream. He didn't lose his temper. That was the most chilling thing about Daniel Whitlock. To the public, he was the billionaire philanthropist. To Maribel, he was a surgeon of psychological pain. But tonight, he had left a mark. Maribel tried to pull herself up, but the room tilted violently. Through the haze, she saw him calmly adjusting his silk tie in the hallway mirror, smoothing his hair as if he hadn't just slammed her head into the marble molding. There was no guilt in his eyes, only the cold disappointment of a man dealing with a faulty appliance. "Look what you've done to the floor, Maribel," Daniel said, his voice as smooth and effortless as an evening news anchor. "How many times have I told you? My associates are off limits. You don't speak to them. You don't look at them. You are the jewel in my crown, not a conversation piece." Maribel wanted to scream that she was just being polite, but the words were lost in the static in her brain. She could only lie there, watching the spots dance in her eyes, trying to keep the world from spinning into blackness. Daniel stepped over her legs as if she were a piece of discarded luggage. He checked his Rolex, then grabbed his suit jacket. "I have a gala to attend. Important people expect to see the man I've built. Clean yourself up. When I return, I expect you to be grateful that I'm keeping your accident a secret." He paused at the door, the moonlight catching the predatory glint in his eyes. "If you're still on the floor when I get back, Maribel, we'll have to find a more permanent place for you to rest. Maybe a hospital wing where they specialize in people who can't remember their own names." "Understood." He walked out. Maribel heard the heavy thud of the reinforced door. 1 click, 2 clicks, a third electronic hum as the security system engaged. Silence fell over the penthouse, heavier than the throbbing in her temples. She waited. 1 minute. 2. She had to be sure. Last time, Daniel had waited in the dark kitchen just to see if she would reach for the landline. When she did, he had smiled before snapping the cord and laughing at her tears. When she was certain he was gone, Maribel reached for the phone that had slipped under the sofa. Pain flared like a lightning strike behind her eyes. She knew the signs of a severe concussion. She needed a doctor, but Daniel owned the board of every hospital in the state. If she checked in, he'd have her committed to a private asylum before morning. She had one chance. One text. With shaking hands and blurred vision, she typed, "He broke my head. Please. It's dark." She hit send. She didn't realize that in her haze, she had reached the one man Daniel Whitlock should have feared more than God himself. The penthouse was a masterpiece of glass and light, a shimmering monument to Daniel Whitlock's success that sat 60 stories above the grit of the city. To the outside world, Maribel Knox lived inside a diamond. The floors were Carrara marble, polished to a mirror finish that reflected the skyline, and the floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view so vast It made everyone else look like ants. But Maribel knew the truth about diamonds. They were the hardest substance on earth, and they were used to cut. 3 years ago, when Daniel had plucked her from the wreckage of her family's bankruptcy, he had called her his saving grace. He had dressed her in silk and draped her in pearls that felt like tiny, cold weights around her throat. He built a world where she never had to lift a finger, but it was a world where she wasn't allowed to move a muscle without his permission. The bruises in the beginning weren't physical, they were invisible. They were the way he deleted her friends' numbers from her phone while she slept, the way he fired her favorite housekeeper for distracting her, and the way he smiled while telling her she was too fragile to handle her own bank accounts. He had built a glass ceiling so low she had to live on her knees just to keep from hitting it. Tonight, the glass had finally shattered. It had started at the charity gala pre-party. A young associate had leaned in to show Maribel a photo of his new retriever puppy. She had smiled, a genuine, human reflex, and for 3 seconds, she felt like a person again. She didn't see Daniel watching from across the room, his champagne flute held with a white-knuckled grip. She didn't see the mask of the philanthropist slip to reveal the predator beneath. The moment the elevator doors hissed shut behind them in the penthouse, the silence became lethal. Daniel didn't yell. He never did. He simply unbuttoned his suit jacket with a clinical precision that made Maribel's blood run cold. "You looked happy, Maribel," he said, his voice a low, melodic thrum. "Did he make you feel special? Did he make you forget who actually owns the air you breathe?" "Daniel, it was just a dog," she whispered, her back hitting the cold marble of the entryway. "He was just showing me a photo. It's never just a dog. It's the look in your eyes. That spark of independence. I thought I'd extinguished that years ago." He stepped into her personal space, the scent of his expensive cologne overwhelming her. He reached out, his thumb tracing her jawline with a tenderness that was more terrifying than a fist. "I've spent millions making you perfect, and you reward me by wagging your tail for a junior analyst." She tried to turn her face away, a final instinct of defiance, and that was when the perfect life ended. He didn't use a fist. He used the flat of his hand in a blindingly fast strike that sent her spinning. The back of her head connected with the sharp, decorative edge of a marble pedestal. The sound was a hollow, sickening thud that seemed to vibrate through her very teeth. White light exploded behind her eyes, followed by a rush of heat, and then a terrifying, heavy coldness. As she slumped to the floor, the world began to tilt. The perfect penthouse was no longer a home. It was a tomb of glass, and as the static began to roar in her ears, Maribel realized the ceiling hadn't just lowered. It had finally collapsed. In a secluded, dimly lit lounge on the other side of the city, the air smelled of expensive tobacco and cold ambition. Kang Jae-Hyun sat at the head of a mahogany table, surrounded by men who moved mountains with a single nod. He was the tiger of Seoul, a man whose pulse never quickened, even when millions were on the line. But when the encrypted phone on the table, a device that had been a silent relic for 3 years, vibrated with a sharp, insistent buzz, the room went unnervingly still. Jae-Hyun picked it up, his dark eyes narrowing as he read the 4 short sentences. "He broke my head. Please. It's dark." The grammar was shaky, the plea primal. His first instinct was to ignore it, a ghost in the machine. But the raw desperation of the words clawed at a part of him he thought he'd buried alongside his own sister. He didn't know who Maribel was, but he knew the sound of someone drowning. "Who is this?" he typed back, his fingers moving with clinical precision. The reply came a minute later, jagged and terrifying. "I'm dizzy. The floor is cold. I think I'm going to sleep now." Jae-Hyun's jaw tightened. As a man who had seen every form of violence, he recognized the clinical markers of a severe concussion. If she fell asleep now, she might never wake up. He stood up abruptly, the heavy mahogany chair screeching against the floor, a sound like a war cry. His men straightened instantly, but he ignored them, his focus locked entirely on the digital lifeline in his palm. "Don't close your eyes," he commanded, his thumb hovering over the screen. "Maribel, if that is your name, listen to me. You cannot sleep. Keep talking to me. Tell me what color the room is. Tell me what you see." He signaled to his head of security, a silent phantom named Minho, and shoved a second tablet toward him. "Trace it," Jae-Hyun mouthed, his voice a low, lethal growl. "Every tower, every relay. I want a floor and a room number in 3 minutes." The phone buzzed again. "Everything is gray. The windows are big. I can see the stars, but they're shaking." "The stars aren't shaking. The world is," Jae-Hyun wrote back, pacing the length of the room like the predator he was named for. "Stay with me. What is his name? The man who did this. Give me a name, and I will give you the moon." He was baiting her, keeping her brain firing, forcing her to process language to fight the encroaching darkness of a brain bleed. He could feel her slipping through the glass, a stranger he had never met but felt a sudden, violent need to claim. "Daniel." The text finally appeared. "He's coming back. I hear the elevator." Jae-Hyun felt a cold, electric thrill of rage. He knew that name. Daniel Whitlock, the golden boy of the city's elite. A man who thought he was untouchable. Jae-Hyun looked at the tablet Minho held up, a pulsing red dot over the Whitlock penthouse. "I'm coming, Maribel," Jae-Hyun typed, his eyes turning to black ice as he reached for his tailored jacket. "Keep your eyes open. If you feel the dark coming, look for my light. I am already at your door." The silence of the penthouse was no longer a sanctuary. It was a countdown. Maribel lay paralyzed on the cold marble, her cheek pressed against the stone, watching the red light of the security sensor blink like a steady, mocking heartbeat. Every pulse of blood in her temples felt like a hammer blow, but Jae-Hyun's words, "Keep talking to me," clung to her consciousness like a jagged anchor. She forced her fingers to move, the screen of her phone glowing with a predatory brightness that made her eyes weep. A low, mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. It was a sound she knew in her marrow, the heavy iron gates of the estate rolling open 60 floors below. Daniel was home. She tried to push herself up, but the world performed a sickening somersault. The ceiling and the floor traded places, and a fresh wave of nausea rose in her throat. She couldn't walk. She could barely crawl, dragging her body toward the shadows of the long hallway. She felt like a wounded animal seeking a hole to die in. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches, each one a struggle to remain silent. Beep, beep, beep. The electronic chime of the primary elevator echoed through the foyer. It was the sound of the wolf entering the fold. Maribel reached the heavy mahogany doors of the library and rolled inside, tucking herself into the narrow, dark gap between a velvet armchair and the floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. She pulled her knees to her chest, the movement sending sparks of white-hot agony through her skull. "Maribel." Daniel's voice drifted through the apartment, terrifyingly calm. It wasn't the shout of an angry man. It was the melodic call of a collector looking for a misplaced prize. His footsteps were rhythmic, the heavy, expensive thud of leather soles on hardwood. He was taking his time. He was enjoying the stillness. "I hope you've used this time to reflect, darling," he continued, his voice growing closer. "I noticed the light was still on in the foyer. You didn't clean up the mess on the marble. That's disappointing. We discussed the importance of order, didn't we?" Maribel squeezed her eyes shut, hot tears carving tracks through the dried blood on her face. Her phone vibrated in her hand. The screen illuminated her hiding spot with a ghostly blue light. She scrambled to cover it with her palm, her heart hammering against her ribs so hard she feared he could hear it. "He's in the house," she typed, her thumbs shaking so violently she hit the wrong keys twice. "I'm in the library. He's coming." The floorboards in the hallway groaned. Daniel stopped right outside the library door. Maribel held her breath until her lungs burned, her vision tunneling into a pinpoint of blackness. She could see the shadow of his polished shoes beneath the door frame. He stayed there for a long beat, perfectly still, as if sniffing the air for the scent of her fear. "I know you can hear me, Maribel," he whispered, his voice vibrating through the wood of the door. "The doctor said you might be confused after a fall like that. I'm here to help you, but you have to come out. If I have to go looking for you, the treatment won't be nearly as gentle." The handle turned. Slowly, deliberately. The heavy door creaked open, admitting a sliver of light that cut across the carpet like a blade. The hunt had begun, and Maribel Knox was out of places to hide. In the back of a custom black SUV cutting through the neon-soaked arteries of the city, Kang Jae-Hyun was a study in lethal composure. While the world outside blurred into a smear of city lights, his world was narrowed down to the glowing interface of a tactical tablet. His thumb traced the screen, commanding a digital shadow army. With a series of rapid keystrokes, he bypassed the municipal firewall, his reach extending into the city's central nervous system. He didn't just want the address. He wanted total visual dominance. "Feed is live, boss," Minho whispered, his voice tight with the shared adrenaline of the hunt. The screen flickered, then resolved into the crisp, high-definition grain of the Whitlock estate's external security cameras. Jae-Hyun watched, his jaw tightening until the muscle pulsed, as a sleek silver sedan pulled into the driveway. He watched the man, Daniel Whitlock, step out of the car. From this distance, Whitlock looked like any other titan of industry, adjusting his cuffs with a terrifying, calm entitlement. But Jae-Hyun didn't see a businessman. He saw a predator returning to a cage. "He's inside," Jae-Hyun grounded out, his voice a low vibration that seemed to chill the air in the vehicle. He toggled the view, jumping from the driveway to the private elevator lobby. He saw the door slide shut on Whitlock's retreating back. The timer on the screen began to climb. 60 floors. At the elevator's speed, that gave him less than 90 seconds before the wolf was at the door. Every second that ticked by was a second where Maribel's fading consciousness was being hunted. Jae-Hyun leaned back, his eyes fixed on the red that represented Maribel's phone. It was stationary in the library. She wasn't moving. That was the most dangerous sign of all. The concussion was winning, or the fear had paralyzed her. "Driver, take the shoulder. Break every limit," Jae-Hyun commanded, his eyes never leaving the screen. He pulled a second phone from his pocket, the one he used for the underworld, a device that moved markets and ended lives. "Get the bird in the air. I want the extraction team on the helipad before I hit the lobby. If a single hair on her head is touched further, I want that building leveled." He looked back at the private line, the one that belonged to a ghost. He typed a single message, his heart thudding against his ribs with a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. "I see him, Maribel. I see everything. He is in the elevator. You have to move. Hide in the dark. I am 3 minutes away. Do not let the silence win." He watched the elevator light on the security feed hit the 58th floor. The 59th. The Tiger of Seoul was no longer just a spectator. He was a force of nature racing against the clock. He realized then that this wasn't just about a wrong number anymore. It was about a man who had spent his life in the dark finally finding something worth bringing into the light, and he would burn the city down before he let Daniel Whitlock take it away. The library door groaned on its hinges, a sound like a funeral bell in the absolute silence of the penthouse. Maribel didn't stay to watch it open. On her hands and knees, she scrambled deeper into the shadows of the adjoining corridor, her vision swimming with violent flares of purple and gold. Every movement felt like a hot needle threading through her brain. She knew this hallway. It led to the master suite's walk-in closet, which concealed a small, reinforced service crawlspace Daniel used for the home's networking servers. It was her only chance. "Running is a form of exercise, Maribel, but in your condition, it's just suicide." Daniel's voice drifted down the hall, light and conversational. He sounded closer now, his leather soles clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. He was playing with her, tracking her by the sound of her uneven breathing. She reached the closet, her fingers fumbling with the hidden latch behind a row of heavy cashmere coats. Her coordination was failing. The world felt as though it were made of water. Finally, the small panel clicked open. She rolled inside the cramped, dark space, the smell of warm electronics and dust filling her nose. It was tight, the walls pressing in on her, but it was a cage she had chosen for herself. She pulled her phone out, the light blindingly bright in the enclosed space. She needed to tell Jae-Hyun she was safe, that she had reached the hole. But as she lifted the device, a sudden, violent wave of vertigo crashed over her. The crawlspace tilted 45 degrees. The internal pressure in her skull spiked, a silent explosion of agony that made her stomach flip. The phone, slick with the cold sweat of her palms, began to slide. She lunged for it, but her muscles refused to obey. Her fingers brushed the glass just as it tipped over the edge of the server rack. It fell, a small, glowing comet in the dark, and hit the metal floor of the main closet with a deafening clack. Silence followed. Then, the sound of Daniel's footsteps stopped directly outside the closet door. "There it is," he whispered, his voice vibrating through the thin panel of her hiding spot. The sound of a secret being dropped. Maribel pressed her hand over her mouth, her eyes wide and stinging with tears. The darkness was absolute now. Without the phone, she was truly alone. She could feel the concussion pulling at her, a heavy, seductive weight beckoning her to close her eyes and let the blackness take her. But through the cracks in the panel, she saw a sliver of light as Daniel opened the closet door. He was standing right there, inches away, and she had no way to tell the tiger that the wolf had found her. The only thing she could hear was the frantic, dying rhythm of her own heart and the slow, deliberate scratch of Daniel's fingernails against the wood of the crawlspace door. The panel didn't just open. It was ripped away with a violent, screeching finality that made Maribel scream, though the sound died in her throat as a ragged gasp. The sudden flood of light from the walk-in closet was blinding, carving through the darkness of the crawlspace and exposing her like a specimen under a microscope. Daniel stood there, framed by the expensive cashmere coats, looking down at her with an expression that was terrifyingly vacant. He reached in, his hand closing around her ankle with the strength of a vice, and dragged her out onto the plush carpet. Maribel's head connected with the floor, a fresh explosion of white light blinding her as she came to rest at his feet. Daniel didn't pick her up. He simply stood over her, looking at the blood-stained phone she had dropped moments before. "Who were you texting, Maribel?" he asked. His voice had lost its melodic charm. It was flat now, vibrating with a cold, jagged edge that she had only heard once before, the night he had broken her spirit. "I checked the logs. It's a dead number. An unlisted line. You're reaching out to ghosts now." He kicked the phone across the room, the device skittering into the shadows. Then, he knelt beside her, his face inches from hers. The charity donor, the golden boy, the gentleman. Every mask he had ever worn was gone. What was left was the hollow, starving soul of a man who viewed people as property. "I've realized something tonight," Daniel whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "You're broken. Not just your head, but your mind. You've become unstable, Maribel. You're seeing things. You're sending messages to people who don't exist. It's tragic, really. A woman of your beauty, losing her grip on reality." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, pre-filled syringe. The light caught the amber liquid inside. Maribel tried to scramble backward, her hands clawing at the carpet, but the concussion made her limbs feel like lead. "The world doesn't need to see you like this," Daniel continued, his eyes wide and unblinking. "I've already made the calls. A private facility upstate. Very discreet. Very permanent. By morning, the headlines will say you've suffered a nervous breakdown and have stepped away for medical rest. You'll be sedated, tucked away in a quiet room where the windows don't open and the doors don't have handles. It's for your own good, darling. I can't have a jewel that talks back, and I certainly can't have one that breaks." He gripped her shoulder, pinning her down as he prepared the needle. "Don't fight it. It's better this way. In that place, it's always dark. You won't have to worry about the stars shaking anymore." Maribel looked up at him, her vision fading into a tunnel of gray. She thought of the text message. She thought of the tiger. She wanted to tell Daniel that the man on the other end of that dead line wasn't a ghost. He was a god of war. But as the needle hovered over her skin, she could only watch in silent horror as the man she had once trusted prepared to erase her existence forever. He was the wolf, and he was finally closing his jaws. The needle was a sliver of cold light, descending toward Maribel's skin with the slow, agonizing inevitability of a guillotine. Daniel's grip on her shoulder was absolute, his eyes devoid of anything resembling humanity. He was smiling, a thin, clinical curve of the lips that signaled her erasure. Maribel tried to flinch, but the darkness in her head was too heavy, her strength too depleted. She closed her eyes, waiting for the chemical sting that would send her into the permanent night. The sound that saved her wasn't a scream or a plea. It was thunder. A violent, rhythmic percussion shook the very foundation of the penthouse. It wasn't the rolling boom of a Chicago storm, but the synchronized, tactical detonation of high-grade breaching charges. The reinforced steel doors of the penthouse, the doors Daniel had bragged were impenetrable, didn't just open, they disintegrated. The shockwave blew out the hallway windows, sending a rain of glass shards across the marble like 1,000 falling diamonds. Daniel froze, the syringe hovering a mere breath away from Maribel's arm. His head snapped toward the foyer, the mask of the calm predator finally cracking to reveal a look of pure, unadulterated confusion. He didn't have time to process the intrusion before the light in the hallway was swallowed by shadows. Through the swirling dust and the scent of cordite, they came. A phalanx of men in tactical black, moving with the silent, terrifying grace of ghosts. They didn't shout commands. They didn't announce their presence. They simply took the space, their weapons raised with clinical focus. And then, the sea of black suits parted. Kang Jae-Hyun stepped into the master suite. He looked as though he had walked out of a nightmare and into a boardroom. His black tailored suit was pristine, contrasting sharply with the chaotic dust motes dancing in the air. His jaw was set in a line of lethal stone, and his eyes, the eyes of the tiger, locked onto Daniel with a predatory heat that seemed to vibrate through the floor. "Get away from her," Jae-Hyun said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. It was the sound of a man who didn't negotiate with the world, but commanded it. Daniel scrambled to his feet, holding the syringe out like a pathetic dagger. "Do you know who I am? This is private property. You're trespassing on." Jae-Hyun didn't let him finish. In 3 blurred strides, he crossed the room. He didn't use a weapon. He used the raw, explosive power of his own hand, catching Daniel's wrist in a grip that made the bones audibly groan. The syringe fell, shattering against the floor. With a fluid, brutal motion, Jae-Hyun drove a knee into Daniel's midsection, sending the billionaire collapsing into the very closet where he had just hunted Maribel. Jae-Hyun didn't spare the fallen man another glance. He dropped to one knee beside Maribel, his movements suddenly losing their lethal edge. He reached out, his large, tattooed hand hovering uncertainly for a second before he gently brushed a lock of blood-matted hair from her forehead. "Maribel," he whispered, his voice a low, rough rasp that cut through the ringing in her ears. "The light is here. Look at me." Maribel opened her eyes, the tunnel of gray finally beginning to recede. She saw the sharp jawline, the intense eyes, and the quiet, controlled rage of the man who had answered her mistake. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fine wool of his sleeve. "You came," she wheezed. Jae-Hyun leaned down, his presence an impenetrable shield between her and the world that had hurt her. "I told you to keep talking," he said, his voice softening into something dangerously protective. "I'm here now, and the dark is over." Daniel scrambled backward into the corner of the closet, his expensive suit jacket bunched up around his neck, the facade of the untouchable billionaire slipping away like melting wax. He looked up at Jae-Hyun, his eyes darting toward the tactical team that now stood like statues of obsidian around the room. "You don't understand," Daniel stammered, his voice thin and desperate. "I have connections. I have the mayor, the police commissioner. I can make you disappear. You're just a common criminal." Jae-Hyun didn't flinch. He didn't even reach for the weapon holstered at his hip. Instead, he pulled a slim, black tablet from his pocket and tapped the screen. A video began to play, projected onto the large hidden television in the suite's media wall. It wasn't a movie, it was a high-definition feed of Daniel's secret offshore accounts, followed by a grainy, infrared recording of Daniel in a dark parking garage, handing a briefcase to a man Jae-Hyun had already liquidated an hour ago. "The common criminal has been busy, Daniel," Jae-Hyun said, his voice a low, terrifying hum. "While you were playing God in this penthouse, I was buying your apostles. Every man you've ever bribed, every judge you've ever bought, they all belong to me now. By the time the sun rises, your accounts will be empty, your foundations will be under federal investigation, and your name will be synonymous with the filth you truly are. Daniel watched the screen, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He watched his life's work, the carefully constructed wall of influence and lies, collapse in a matter of seconds. "You can't do this," he whispered. "The evidence, it's protected." "Nothing is protected from the tiger," Jae-Hyun replied, stepping closer until his shadow completely engulfed the smaller man. "I didn't come here to kill a man of your status. I came here to ensure you had no status left. I'm not going to shoot you, Daniel. That would be too quick. I'm going to let the world see the monster you are. I'm going to let the system you corrupted swallow you whole. But first," Jae-Hyun leaned down, his eyes turning to black ice. "You told Maribel that in the place you were sending her, it was always dark. You told her she wouldn't have to worry about the stars shaking." He grabbed Daniel by the collar, lifting him effortlessly until the man's toes barely brushed the carpet. "I've changed your reservation. You aren't going upstate. You're going to a hole I've dug personally. And in that hole, there are no stars at all." He tossed Daniel toward his enforcers as if he were a piece of trash. "Take him. Strip him of everything. If he tries to speak, remind him that silence is the only thing he can still afford." Jae-Hyun turned his back on the man's pathetic pleas, his focus returning to Maribel, who was watching from the floor with wide, trembling eyes. The price of silence had been paid in full, but the cost to her soul was yet to be tallied. He reached out to lift her, his touch a silent promise that while the world had ended for Daniel Whitlock, for her, the first breath of a new life was finally beginning. The transition from the darkness was not a sudden burst of light, but a slow, rhythmic blooming of warmth. When Maribel finally opened her eyes, the jagged static that had defined her world for so long was gone. There was no ringing in her ears, no nauseating tilt to the floor, and no shadow of a man waiting to strike. Instead, she was greeted by a ceiling of soft, gilded moldings and the gentle scent of sandalwood. The air was still, heavy with a peace she hadn't known in 3 years. She was lying in a bed that felt like a cloud, draped in silk sheets the color of a sunrise. As she moved her head, she braced for the familiar spike of agony, but it never came. The pressure was gone. Her mind felt clear, the shattered pieces of her memory finally knitting back together into a cohesive whole. She wasn't in a hospital wing or a cold asylum. She was in a sanctuary. "You've been asleep for a long time, Maribel." The voice was a low, resonant vibration that seemed to anchor her to the room. She turned her head slowly and saw him. Kang Jae-Hyun was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair by the window, the morning light catching the sharp angle of his jaw and the dark, protective intensity in his eyes. He wasn't wearing the tactical gear of a ghost or the pristine suit of a businessman. He wore a simple black sweater, his sleeves pushed back to reveal the intricate ink that marked him as a man of the underworld. Yet, as he looked at her, his expression held a tenderness that was more powerful than any weapon. "How long?" she whispered, her voice raspy but steady. 3 weeks, Jae-Hyun replied, rising from the chair and moving to the bedside with the silent grace of the predator he was. "The doctors had to keep you under to let the swelling subside. They said you were a fighter. I told them I already knew that." Maribel reached up, her fingers tracing the faint, fading scar near her hairline. It was a map of where she had been, but it no longer hurt. She looked around the room, at the gold leaf on the walls, the vast windows overlooking a private garden, and the lack of locks on the doors. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a cage. "Daniel?" she asked, the name tasting like ash. Jae-Hyun's eyes darkened for a fleeting second, a shadow of the tiger returning. "Daniel Whitlock is a ghost. His empire has been dismantled, his name has been erased, and he is currently in a place where he will never see the sun again. You don't ever have to speak that name again." He sat on the edge of the bed, reaching out to take her hand. His palm was warm, his grip firm and grounding. Maribel didn't flinch. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, not as a jewel or a trophy, but as a person who had survived the unthinkable. "You lived in a world that tried to extinguish you, Maribel," Jae-Hyun said, his voice dropping to a fierce, quiet vow. You reached out into the dark, and I caught you. I told you that night that I was coming, and I meant it. From this moment on, your life belongs only to you. But if you choose to stay, know this: nobody will ever dim your light again. I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone even look at you with a shadow in their eyes. Maribel looked at the man who had answered a wrong number and changed the course of fate. She didn't need a mirror to know that the spark Daniel had tried to kill was back, burning brighter than ever. She squeezed Jae-Hyun's hand, a small, knowing smile touching her lips. The war was over, the head was healed, and the girl in the glass cage had finally become the queen of the tiger's heart.